And like Kaylee said, my name is Josh Campbell, and I work for OSU Extension. I'm based in the Oklahoma City Metro, but if you're not familiar with the way OSU Extension works, we are kind of the service branch of Oklahoma State University. We have offices in each one of Oklahoma's 77 counties, and along with research facilities across the state. And so the work that I do involves the space of urban agriculture, natural resources, urban horticulture, and I get to kind of teach others a little bit about those topics. And so um, we'll just jump right into things today. I will say that 45 minutes to an hour to cover backyard composting and improving garden soils is really just time to scrape the surface. I actually teach a 6-week course just on backyard composting called the Master Composter class, and we're actually in week 3 of that right now. So we'll share a lot of information today, but we're not going to probably answer all your questions, but hopefully give you some resources to feel comfortable as you think about having success with backyard composting and gardening. So I think most of us get into composting probably because of our interest in gardening. And so it's important that we start with the discussion of composting with a little bit of discussion about soil. And not all of us are going to be interested in composting purely for gardening. There's certainly a waste management and environmental stewardship type perspective that we will talk about with composting. But in general, we think about it in relation to gardening. And so when we think about an ideal garden soil, you may have seen something like this before. But when we talk about an ideal soil, we're talking about something that is going to be somewhere around 45 to 48% mineral material. So that would be the clay particles, the sand particles, or the silt particles, the base material that makes up the majority of that soil. We also want organic matter. Organic matter kind of acts as an aggregator or a glue for the soil particles, and as a food source for the living organisms within the soil. But then we also want a soil that's not too compact, a soil that is porous so that air and water can readily flow through that. So we want about 50% pore space. However, as you may have experienced in your own landscapes and gardens, most urban soils compared to natural soils or ideal soils are going to be much higher in mineral material. So we often find in developed neighborhoods that topsoil is scraped away, that pad site for building neighborhoods is compacted, and homes are built, sod is laid, and then when we go to establish our landscapes or gardens, we're left with a really difficult situation when it comes to soil, especially here in Oklahoma, where we have tend to have a lot of clay content in our soils. And so we tend to have in urban soils more compaction, more concentration of mineral matter, sand, silt, and clay, and less pore space for air and water to flow, and certainly less organic matter. And so it leads to some challenges when it comes to our soils. Erosion can be an issue, even flooding, because the rainfall that we get isn't able to infiltrate into that soil. And certainly from a productivity standpoint for nutrient availability for plants and things, it's a challenge. And so when we think about how we improve soil quality for gardening, certainly there are different angles that we can approach this from. But I will say that in my experience, adding organic matter is the quickest and most effective and efficient way to improve soil quality in a short amount of time. And so incorporating organic matter can be done in a number of ways, but the easiest way for us as gardeners to do that is simply to make and utilize compost that we incorporate into our garden soils. And organic matter, when I say organic, I mean little o, not a certified organic product, but just something that is organic in the sense that it was once alive. It will decay and break down over time and turn into soil. And so as we incorporate organic matter into our soils, we're going to increase drainage. And certainly with clay soils, we're going to actually help break them up so that they infiltrate water better, and that they more readily can accept water. So you think about areas of a garden or soil areas in a landscape that are prone to ponding or to flooding after a heavy rain. Incorporating organic matter into those areas can help reduce those issues. And then if you think about a sandy soil that may have the opposite problem, water is going to move very quickly through those soils, and with it, that water is going to carry away important nutrients like nitrogen, and so we can actually use organic matter as a way to slow that down and reduce the speed at which moisture and nutrients move through that soil. And organic matter also is a building block for healthy soils that are biologically diverse, and so as we incorporate organic matter into our soils, there are a lot of benefits. One of the main benefits, we think about a summer like we've had, where we had warm temperatures, last year especially, where we had very little rainfall to speak of. And so drought conditions, it can pose a major challenge to successfully gardening. And as we incorporate compost onto bare soils in thin layers, or maybe we till it in some matter, we can over time increase the organic matter of that soil. And so most soils, you saw that first slide that I shared, that an ideal soil has about 5% organic matter. Most soils in Oklahoma are going to be around 1% or less in organic matter. But as we work to increase organic matter content in our soils through the incorporation of compost or other methods of increasing organic matter, we can make significant strides in terms of our soil's ability to hold on to rainfall when we get it, or onto irrigation that we put out, and to store it as a reservoir for when it's needed by plants. And so for every 5% increase in organic matter, organic material in the soil, we can actually quadruple that soil's ability to serve as a water holding reservoir. When we think about composting, I think that the first thing that often comes to people's mind is that composting is a fertilizer or some sort of nutrient source, and it is certainly a nutrient source. And so I don't want you to not think of it as an important way to add nutrients to the soil, but it is not primarily a nutrient source. It's actually a way to improve the overall condition and health of a soil beyond just providing macro level nutrients that a plant might need. And so we have to think about composting a little bit more holistically, and we have to think about it as a way to harness natural processes like decomposition and things that would happen in nature on their own. And we're harnessing that for our own benefit so that we can turn waste material like food scraps and leaves and things from our landscape or our gardens into a material that's often called humus, that fully decomposed, dark, really beautiful looking compost material that we can then use to improve our soil conditions over time. And so we have to think about it as a natural process that when we're engaging in composting, we're just harnessing some natural processes that are already at work in nature, and we're using those for our benefit. And we can certainly do some things to improve our composting efficiency. We can utilize different methods or different bins or containers that may improve the way that we compost, but we can't give ourselves too much credit for the composting process. Our job as somebody who wants to be a successful composter is to make the conditions suitable for this workforce. And I call these things you see here on the screen the compost workforce. So, as organic debris is put out in a pile, you have bacteria and fungi and macroorganisms like earthworms and snails and sow bugs and other things, all the way down to, to microorganisms that we can't see with the eye, and they're all working together, performing their function, their portion of that process of decomposition. And so while we play a role, the main workforce in composting is the group of organisms you see here on the screen. And so it's really about making conditions suitable for them to thrive. And that's how we can be effective at composting. Another thing I like to say is dirt is a 4-letter word. And there's a now retired professor who ran our OSU soils labs. And so if you're not familiar, OSU offers soil testing services for gardening and for home well water and for forages that you can feed to animals, number of different testing services. One of the things we can do is test your home garden soil and kind of counsel you through what you can do to improve that, maybe what nutrients need to be added to successfully garden. And our soil lab director taught some soil classes, and he was known to say that dirt is a 4-letter word. And I would push back a little bit and say, well, yes, dirt is definitely a 4-letter word, D-I-R-T, that's 4 letters. But what he was getting at is that we should view dirt as a cuss word in a sense, because soil is what we talk about when we're talking about a productive growing medium for plants, for gardening. And so soil's alive, it's full of organic material, microorganisms, and it contains the nutrients and the things that plants need to grow, whereas dirt is void of that. Dirt is just that base material that we talked about earlier. And so the way we turn dirt into soil, the easiest way to do that is to add compost and to increase organic matter content in that soil. And I love this quote because I think it's really true for gardeners. It says, a poor gardener grows weeds, a good gardener grows vegetables, and a great gardener grows soil. And I think as gardeners, if we start with the soil, and if we can really make improvements to the soil conditions where we're trying to grow, a lot of the other issues that we are facing as gardeners will start to go away, and we'll start to see improvements just as a result of making improvements to the soil. I mentioned this as well. There's certainly a waste management component when it comes to thinking about composting. And this is a graphic that I borrowed from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. I encourage you to check them out if you haven't. They have lots of great resources, research, publications, and just data that they've collected on composting. And they say that across the United States, 50% of the waste material that we generate through typical municipal garbage is material that could be composted. So 21% of the US waste stream is food scraps, 15% is some sort of paperboard. So think about like paper towels, about cardboard, things like that. 8% would be yard trimmings like grass clippings and leaves. And then another 8% would be wood waste. And so 50% of all the waste that we generate in the US is potentially compostable. And so there's a huge opportunity when we think about making reduction in the waste stream and things, to think about composting as a way of doing that. And the World Health Organization and the EPA and several other organizations have acknowledged that composting is a potential low-hanging fruit when we think about things that we can do to address climate instability and climate issues that we may face in the future. Another thing I like to point out for us here in Central Oklahoma, or wherever we are across the state, but primarily here in Central Oklahoma, where we have a little bit less topography than other parts of the state. Our highest points of elevation in Oklahoma County, and I believe in Cleveland County as well, and probably in a number of other parts of the state are our landfills. And so the highest point of elevation in Oklahoma County is a trash mountain. With that, when it comes to composting, we have to remember that there are two types of composting. When we decide that we want to compost, we kind of are faced with a fork in the road moment. And I think this is where many people run into frustration with their experience in composting. Perhaps you've composted or tried to compost before and not had the success that you've wanted. And I would suggest to you that maybe stepping back and thinking about this fork in the road moment and setting some expectations for your composting may save you some headache and some frustration. And so what I mean by that is that when it comes to composting, there's the kind of the slow and lazy method, and then there's the very intensive and controlled method. And so I call cold or static composting that more lazy, slow method. And this is going to be trying to pile up material. Maybe you add it as you have that material. So you have a few food scraps here, a few leaves, and you're adding it as you go. In that method of composting, you can certainly produce some really good compost, but it's going to take a long time, and you're going to have materials that are in various stages of decomposition. You're never going to get hot enough in that composting probably to totally reduce the weed seed contamination that you might have. And you have to think about it as a longer term play. And you're probably also going to have to, from time to time, just dig into that material and sift out the good stuff that's there and continue on with your composting. Whereas with hot composting, this is more of the method that would be used in, say, a production composting type of situation where you're trying to yield compost fairly quickly. You're trying to yield a consistent end product. And so in order to hot compost, there's some things that we have to think about. A hot compost pile is going to need the right mixture of nitrogen, or what you might call green materials, and carbon materials, what you might call brown materials. So that right ratio of dry and wet, nitrogen, carbon, so that pile heats up and is effectively composting. You're going to need about 2 to 3 parts carbon for every 1 part nitrogen. And you're going to need some moisture. You're going to need the right size pile. And so these are just some things you need to consider when you engage in composting. I think a lot of us, maybe the first time we get into composting, we think we're going to pile some stuff up, and then we can come back to that pile in a few months and it's just going to look like this beautiful, black gold material. And that's just not the case, especially when we're doing a cold and static composting. You may find that over a period of a couple of years, you dig down into that pile and that may be happening, but certainly not going to happen quickly. However, I will tell you that composting can be done very, very, very quickly, depending on the amount of money and inputs that you want to put into it. There are certainly methods that can yield composting within a matter of a few days or a few weeks. And so depending on the input and effort you want to put forward, you can compost quickly if you want to. Typically with backyard composting, in order to hot compost, you're going to need a minimum of a 3-foot by 3-foot pile or group of material. And so most backyard composters are going to be operating in that kind of cold or static composting arena, but it's possible to hot compost at home if you want to do that. Let's see here. So for compost to happen effectively and quickly, this is a graphic I borrowed from the University of Arizona Extension. Essentially, you need the right combination of brown material and green material. You need water, you need air, you need macro and microorganisms. And when they all converge in that perfect point, that's when compost is going to happen quickly and effectively. You'll hear people say you can't compost this or that. And I just want I just want to put this out here as a quick talking point. Certainly when we think about backyard composting, there are some things we want to avoid just because of their potential risks and the dangers that they may pose. However, there are many things that can be composted if the right processes are in place. So certainly when it comes to meats and dairy products and other things that we may tell you in a backyard setting or a home composting setting not to compost, in a commercial controlled type of system, those things can effectively be composted. But in general, a list of some things to think about not composting in your backyard would be things like animal waste, meats and dairy products, oils, greases. And the main reason for this is that they either have some risk of potential pathogen transfer. You think about Salmonella or E. coli or something like that that could be transferred, especially if you're talking about taking that compost and putting it onto a vegetable garden setting and then eating some of that produce. But then there's also an increased risk of pests. So anytime you're putting meats or things like that out there, you're inviting and encouraging rodents and other things that you wouldn't want to have in your compost pile. So in general, we think about things that are ideal for composting as things that are yard waste, so brush and twigs, and then other home waste, cardboard, egg cartons, newspapers, etc. Food scraps, so things like coffee grounds and eggshells and fruit and grass clippings and other things you see listed here. Those are ideal for composting. A little pro tip that I like to share. I found that if you collect your food scraps from your kitchen waste in a little container and then you freeze them, then you put them in your compost pile, they actually will break down much quicker and you're going to have a lot less issue with like gnats and fruit flies and things like that. Okay, when it comes to small scale backyard composting, it can almost be overwhelming, the amount of options. And I think for many of us, maybe we start out with a tumbler of some kind that we purchase at a garden center, or perhaps we go big and we have a backyard and we try to build a 3-bin composting system. And maybe we have some sort of grand vision that we'll be composting and then it kind of goes south and we let it we just kind of let it go, and maybe we haven't had the success that we wanted. And I maintain that a lot of times we just aren't aware of the different methods of composting that are out there, and perhaps we're not matched with the best composting method for us. And so I like to say there's a compost pile to fit every style. And you look here, these are just a small example of the different types of composting that you could engage in a backyard setting. And so one of the things that I like to do, and I actually have my students in my composting class that I teach, a 6-week composting class, I have them take this quiz. If you did a Google search for Compost Quiz, it'll be the first thing that comes up, but it was created by the city of Saskatchewan, Canada. They have a composting program as a part of their city municipal waste management. And so if you go to this link, it will take you to a page that looks like this, and you can actually take a quiz, and I call it a composting dating site. So it's going to match you with your perfect compost method, and so it's a good way to do a kind of a dating match with your perfect compost method. You don't have to put in your email address. You can just click take quiz and go right into taking the quiz. So you don't have to put in your email address like you see there. And what it'll do, it'll ask you a series of questions. And as you answer the questions, it's going to navigate through based on your responses and match you with the compost method that it believes is best for you. So things like how much time do you have? How much effort do you want to put in? How much space do you have? things like that will be asked. And what I find interesting when I teach my composting class, very few people are matched with the same exact composting method. And so it really does a pretty good job of kind of taking some detail to your responses and matching you with different methods. With that, I kind of just want to highlight a few different composting methods that kind of span the scale of larger backyard scale all the way down to kind of more indoor scale, and then talk to you a little bit about some of the science of how composting happens, and we can maybe open it up for some question and discussion before our time is over today. So 3-bin system is one that I think a lot of people are familiar with. And the idea behind this system is basically that you have 3 bins and you start with your first or your largest bin and you're filling it up with material. As you fill it up with material, it's starting to decompose a little bit. Maybe you're keeping it moist. You've got airflow through these open sides. And once it's filled up and you're ready to add more material, but this bin is full, you have the opportunity to put everything in the middle bin, and that aerates it and moves it to this middle bin and allows you to begin filling up the first bay again. Once you've filled up this first bin area, the second time, you can move the middle material to the final bay, first bay to the middle, and you can start filling it up again. And the idea is that by the time you've filled it up for the 3rd time, that the material here should be ready to use and to harvest as finished compost. And that's kind of the idea behind that one. Certainly, we are probably familiar with compost tumblers, and these are nice if you don't have a lot of space. You can purchase them at garden centers, and so they're readily available. They're contained, so they have less risk of rodents and other pests getting into them. However, one downside is that as they get full, they can certainly be heavy and kind of cumbersome and hard to turn. And so maybe if you have mobility issues, they could be a challenge. And they also don't tend to yield a large volume of compost. One of my favorite methods is Verma composting. And it's one of my favorite things to teach with youth and even adults. You can take a plastic little storage tub and purchase some worms at a garden center or online and shred some newspaper material, and you're kind of off to the races. And you can feed a worm bin like this 1 to 2 pounds of food scraps a week, and they will churn through that and turn that into a compost material that's called Verma Compost. Really, really fun way to compost. It's done. You can do it inside. In fact, at my office in our OSU building, I have a couple of these bins under my desk area, and so it's an easy way to put food scraps from the office in and to have some compost that you can use on house plants and other things. And so a really fun method, and I'll show you later how to access some resources that'll give you more information about some of these different composting methods if there's one that you have a specific interest in learning more about. Lasagna or sheet composting is a way to think about composting in place to maybe build soil more broad scale. Maybe you're wanting to garden in ground in an area in the future. And so you can lay cardboard, you can lay different organic material down and kind of build soil in place. So here's some examples of that being done. This is a garden area where they're kind of expanding the garden in that manner. This is a raised bed, and it can be really expensive to fill a raised bed with soil from the outset. And so you can layer material in the bottom of that raised bed to kind of add some bulk and to reduce the amount of soil that you'd have to fill into that space. Trench composting is another method. If your goal is just to improve the soil or just to reduce the amount of kitchen waste or landscape waste that you're sending to the landfill, simply digging a hole and burying the waste material is a great way to do it, and will add organic matter to that soil over time. So this could be done in a large scale setting by digging a trench and burying organic material, but it can also be done in a small scale setting, just in a little raised bed or garden area, shoveling up an area, putting some waste there and covering it back up. And so an option for you. Bokashi composting, this is a method that's very popular in Asia. So imagine maybe you live in an apartment setting, maybe a high-rise apartment setting in a very urban, dense area. And what do you do with your food waste? Well, one option is Bokashi composting, where you can fill a bucket and you use this bran material and you layer it over your food scraps, and it actually kind of ferments your food scraps, so you have very little stench, and it kind of stabilizes your food scraps in kind of a fermented way, so that you can carry that bucket off and then do trench composting. And so, like in Japan, for instance, a lot of people will do this, and maybe on the weekend, if they're going to go out for a picnic or go out into nature somewhere, they have the opportunity to put this compost waste material into a place where it can be composted. Or maybe you are a part of a community garden or a church garden and you don't have the means to compost at home, but this is a way to stabilize that until you can get that material there. And so an interesting method if you're interested in that. Another method that is popular around the world is this idea of, or this concept of keyhole composting or keyhole gardening. Essentially, you're building a cylinder that you can fill with compost, and then you have a raised bed around that. And some models, some designs allow you to kind of access the compost below. So this one would have some slats that you could remove and harvest compost. And then others just allow you to have kind of a little keyhole cut out so you can access the compost area. And then you're growing around that. And those plants are benefiting as the nutrients are leaching and the soil's improving from that compost. Those plants are benefiting. The main emphasis with all of what I just showed you is to show you that there are a number of different composting types, and there are pros and cons, or advantages and disadvantages to all of those. And so I won't spend too much time on this slide, but this is just a screen grab from a table that was put together in one of our OSU informational fact sheets on composting. And it kind of talks about the disadvantages or the pros and cons of different composting methods. So an example, a tumbler is neat and tidy, works well for small spaces, but it's awkward at harvest time and can be a challenge if you have mobility issues. So there's pros and cons to every method that you should be aware of, and that you should think about before you just jump into choosing compost. All right, so if you want to be successful with composting, specifically if you want to compost quickly and you want to compost in a manner that's hot, you need to have 4 factors that you keep in mind. And if you can effectively control all 4 of these factors, you're going to be successful with composting. So that ratio of carbon to nitrogen is the first thing that you need to think about. The size of the particles that are going into your pile are important. So the larger the pieces are when they go in, the longer it's going to take to decompose and to break down. And so if you can chip wood material up through a little cheap grinder or chipper, or leaves through a little leaf chipper, you're going to have compost that's finished and usable much quicker. You can find a little 2-3 inch wood diameter electric wood chipper on Amazon for somewhere in the $100 to $200 range. Moisture is also important, and I think this is probably one of the factors that we think the least about when it comes to composting. But a good compost pile is going to need to have moisture. Think about like the forest floor. If you've ever been on a hike in the woods and you pull back some leaves, that rotting organic matter there. There's usually it's damp and there's some moisture there no matter the time of year. And so we need to maintain some moisture for conditions to be conducive to composting. And then we also need to have some airflow and some aeration. So if we can think about those 4 factors and we can control those, we can compost very effectively and efficiently. I'm going to briefly talk about each of these 4 factors as we wrap up and hopefully have some time for maybe a few questions. So carbon and nitrogen it's in all plant material, all organic material. And carbon is primarily found in the cellulose and the lignin of plants. So it's that more what I would call woody or rigid parts of the plant. It's what gives the plants their cell wall strength. Whereas nitrogen is mostly found in plant proteins. And so it's going to be the more tender new growth parts of the plant. And when we think about a carbon-nitrogen ratio, we're talking about the estimation of the dry weight of the two. Okay. And so if we want maximum composting efficiency, let's say we were going to go into business and we wanted to start our own composting business and we wanted to have maybe some sort of standards that we put in place, we would try to think about balancing that carbon to nitrogen ratio in somewhere around a 30-to-1 ratio. Okay. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and then I'm gonna ask you as a backyard composter to kind of forget about what I've just told you and to think about it in a different way. But I want you to understand if you hear somebody talking about composting, maybe as you're reading about it or as you're watching a video on composting, so that you understand where that carbon to nitrogen ratio comes from. So all things have a ratio of carbon to nitrogen. Some are going to have more or a greater carbon to nitrogen ratio than others. And so an example here, if we were to say we wanted to have a control the inputs that we're putting into our compost pile so that we can consistently get similar results and compost quickly and effectively, we could come up with carbon to nitrogen ratios. You can Google different products and find a carbon to nitrogen ratio estimation. I'm sure ChatGPT would also probably have something to tell you about carbon to nitrogen ratios of different materials. And so these are some examples. If we said grass clippings are 15-to-1 carbon to nitrogen, leaves 60-to-1, and vegetable waste 12-to-1, we could create a little simple fraction that we simplify, and we would have somewhere around a 29-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So if you think about compost products that you buy, people that are composting in a commercial scale, they're trying to control the input output so that what they bring in and what they put out as far as the compost product is maintaining some sort of consistency in terms of the time it takes to process that compost and the end product that they get. And so that's why carbon to nitrogen ratios are important. But in general, a simple rule of thumb for backyard composters is to think about a 3-to-1 volume of your brown and green material. So for every 3 handfuls of leaves or wood chips or whatever that brown material is, I want 1 handful of vegetable scraps or some sort of coffee grounds or whatever. So 3-to-1 ratio of brown to green material by volume. I mentioned this, particle size is really important. So as we decrease particle size, we're going to have quicker composting. Same with water. If we can maintain somewhere about 50% moisture, when we touch that compost, if it feels a little bit damp, kind of like a wrung out sponge, then we're in the place we want to be. We don't want it to be saturated to where it's sloshing with water, but we do want some moisture there. And then oxygen is critical for, especially when we think about the speed of composting. The more that oxygen is introduced into our piles, whether that be the way we build the bins or where it's positioned in our landscape, the more quickly that we're going to see breakdown occur. There are a number of different graphics you can find out there. This is one that I borrowed from a master composter manual, and it's kind of neat. It's a little little tool for troubleshooting your composting. So you can go around and see if there's a problem you're having. Let's say your pile has a bad odor. It's pretty smelly. It's likely that your pile is too wet. So if materials are clumped and you're lacking airflow, turn your pile, mix in bulk material, mix in brown material. So there's different kind of a key to kind of figure out different problems that you might be having with your compost pile. There's lots of these out there. They're fun to kind of engage with. But what I tell people is, if you're having a problem, whatever the problem is, there's lots of problems listed here, but if you're having a problem, it's going to go back to one of those 4 factors that we talked about: your carbon to nitrogen ratio, your particle size, your moisture, and your oxygenation of your pile. And if you are addressing all 4 of those, you're gonna be able to solve the problems that you have with your compost pile. Occasionally, people will ask about compost tea and compost tea products. We don't have time to go in depth on this today, but I will just tell you that there are a lot of excellent compost tea products out there, but there are also some things that are probably not providing as much value as maybe you might think or are as advertised. So by law, the U.S. Department of Agriculture requires that anything that is sold as a compost tea be steeped in water for over an hour. So you'll find different products sold in different names, but you can at least know that compost tea is a dry compost that has been soaked into water. And so what's happening with compost teas is that you're basically extracting the nutrients that are in that compost into a liquid form so that you can then use it to water around plants or even spray on plant surfaces. And there are a number of benefits with it, but just be aware of compost teas and do your research a little bit before you just buy a product, because not all products are created equal when it comes to compost teas. If you're interested in composting, I do teach a master composter class. We have one that's taught in Tulsa and one that's taught in Oklahoma City, and we may have a few others popping up across the state. It's a 6 to 8 week program, depending on who's teaching it. Provides hands-on training, including field trips, to learn about composting in different ways. It's geared towards adult learners, so 18 plus. And over the course of 6 weeks, we cover everything from solid waste and recycling to backyard composting. I'm currently in week 3 of this year's class. And so we're talking about the compost ecosystem, macro and microorganisms that are involved in the composting process. We get to actually look at the microscope and see some of the things that are going on in the compost pile. We build worm bins. We go out and see what's going on in the community with composting, and we actually go tour some commercial facilities. And so it's a really cool way to see what's going on with composting across the spectrum of scale. And I teach it every September and October, usually mid-September through late October. So unfortunately, it's too late this year, but certainly would love to have you join us if you would like to do that for next year. We have an OSU Extension fact sheet page. So if you type in extension.okstate.edu or you can type in facts.okstate.edu, and in the search bar, you can type in anything you like. You could type in composting, and it would generate all of the different resources that we have published on composting. So things like Verma composting fact sheets and different web pages that we have on composting. We have a number of different composting fact sheets. These are just a few of the many that we have, and you can find all of those there. So you can actually go to the landing page, and then you can click print as PDF, and you can get a digital, Adobe version that you can open up and read, or you can print it as well. Another resource I'd like to share with you if you're a gardener and wanting to learn more about composting is our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. So Oklahoma Gardening is the longest running gardening television show in history, I'm told. It's been running consecutively without stop since 1973, I believe. And it's filmed, it's a production of Oklahoma State University, and it's filmed at the OSU Botanic Garden in Stillwater and other sites across the state. And all of the episodes air Saturdays on PBS at 11 a.m. and then Sundays at 3 p.m. on PBS. But you can also find them on our YouTube channel. And so if you're not familiar with the Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel, you should definitely go check it out. You can actually search the channel. So don't search the top bar here. That'll take you back to YouTube ads. But if you search internally in the channel, you'll actually find that there are dozens and dozens of videos on any topic you can think of. And so encourage you to check that out. Some really helpful videos on composting and other gardening topics that you might find interesting. I'll also make a shameless plug for something that I do. I have a podcast called the Urban Gardener Podcast that I do with a colleague of mine here at OSU. It's a very low production value podcast, so it's not the greatest of audio. It's not something we do. It's just above and beyond we do for fun for our work. So it's take it for what it is. It's fun information and discussion regarding gardening here local to Central Oklahoma. And so I think if you're a podcast listener and you like gardening, you'll find some interesting stuff there. We're on Spotify and anywhere else that podcasts are. Another resource you might be interested in is the Oklahoma Compost Conference. So if you really want to take a deep dive into composting, but maybe you don't have 6 weeks to do that in our class, you could give up a Friday and go take part in this conference. You'll find that people from academia and people from municipal government, public waste, tribal organizations, you name it. There's a lot of folks that are working in and around the composting and solid waste management space that come to this conference. And this year, the conference will be held in Choctaw at the Eastern Oklahoma Technology Center on October 26th. The QR code there will take you to the webpage where you can find out about registering for that conference. It should be a really good one this year. The speakers this year, I think, are the keynote at least is coming from the U.S. Compost Council. With that, I will stop sharing my screen, and I think we might have a few minutes for some questions, or I can maybe get to any things that came up in the chat.
We do have a few questions that did pop up in the chat and in the Q&A section. Sorry, I lost my little button there. I'm going to go ahead and start with first what I received in Q&A. What is the best way to compost eggshells? They seem to take a very long time to break down. And what about fruit skins, oranges, melons, things like that?
Yeah, good questions. So with eggshells, I mean, you can put them right into the compost pile. They do take time to break down. So one of my favorite things to do is to either put them in the freezer or to let them dry out and then to just throw them in an old blender or something and powder them down. You can actually use those eggshells in small amounts and even in worm bins, because the worms need some grit in their diet. So that's something that a lot of Verma composters do. But I would say the most effective way to make them break down quicker is just to run them through a blender, an old food processor or something, and then put them into your compost. As far as the citrus, oranges, lemons, limes, things like that, they're fine in a compost pile. Again, they may not break down very quickly if you're not chopping them up. So the smaller, the more chopped up the material is when we put it into the pile, the quicker it's going to break down. You will hear people say that maybe they're worried about pH or things like that with citrus because they are a little bit more acidic. In general, I don't find that to be a big issue unless you're just, you own an orange grove and you're composting nothing but citrus. I don't imagine that being an issue. And also most of our soils in Oklahoma are on the alkaline side. And so we actually need a little bit of acidic buffer down. And so we could benefit from that.
Another one. Many people I know have tried compost. Many people I know who have tried composting stated that it attracted critters. I believe you kind of touched on this with that little wheel for troubleshooting, but just in case, but not the healthy composting crew of insects, so it discouraged them from doing it again. Any recommendations about this? So I know you kind of touched on it. I'm not
Hmm.
sure if that
I
little
can
wheel
add to
answered it
that
or
for
not.
sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is one of the quickest ways to scare somebody away from composting is to find a big rat or something, in your pile. You don't want that. Um, in my experience, what I know is that two things I'll share. The more moist your pile is, if you're maintaining the right moisture, you're going to be much less likely to deal with things like mice and rats in your pile because they want to go in there. There's a food source, and usually it's dry and they can get in there. So if you keep your pile moist, you're gonna not have a rodent issue. The other thing is anytime you add food scraps, you need a cap. So if you're going to add a bunch of rotting food material, you need to cap it off with a dry brown material, leaves or wood chips or something like that, and 6 to 8 inches minimum capping that will help prevent that being a draw for critters. And so I would say focus on making sure there's the right amount of moisture in your pile and making sure that you are capping off your piles with a carbon source of some kind so that you don't just have open rotting organic matter right there exposed.
We have
But
two more. They should be pretty quick. Is it safe to add grass clippings from a lawn that is being treated with chemicals to kill weeds to a recycle bin?
I'm not sure if I understand the second part of that question. So taking lawns from a lawn that's being treated with chemicals to a recycle bin.
Yes.
What I will say is that yes, you can compost grass clippings from a lawn. Um, I don't have a lot of time to go into the science of it today, but in general, what you'll find with most lawn-based herbicides, research shows that if you are hot composting, they will be um, they will be rendered inert in the hot composting process. So either time or heat will cure most of your evils when it comes to any chemicals that are there. The other thing is most lawn chemicals that are used are going to be um, fairly benign compared to agricultural substances. And so there are some things, if you're going to be using, like, say, a heavy manure-based compost that you buy from, say, a stockyard or something like that, there are some herbicides that are used on hay production settings that can be then consumed by animals, pass through the gut of that animal, and have the potential for up to 2 years to cause some issue with your plant. So we see it in kind of vegetable production settings where maybe somebody buys a load of manure-based compost, they put it out around their tomatoes, and they all wilt and die. So in general, I would say I wouldn't be worried about using lawn clippings, but I would let them age for at least probably 3 to 6 months before I use them, or um, or I would, try to make sure that I'm hot composting. And then certainly if it's an animal-based manure compost, I would probably investigate a little bit, ask some questions about, what the source of that composting material is, and let it age before using it.
Okay, so I've received one more question. The other is, I'll ask the second one at the end. Um, what about coffee or tea grounds in compost? I know you kind of touched on the solutions, but not like coffee grounds or tea.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think those are both great products. Coffee ground compost. Coffee grounds are going to be a great source of potentially adding some moisture, but also they're high in nitrogen, and so they're going to be a great source for the compost pile. Add as much coffee as you want. And tea's the same way.
And there's a little bit of interest in the Master Composter program. Where does one go to learn more and sign up? And is it only in person or is there a virtual component?
Yeah, currently we did a virtual option in the height of the pandemic, and it worked okay. But because of the nature of the class being a this specific class being very hands-on in nature, and we actually go to some composting facilities, we do that class. We do that class primarily in person. So there are some opportunities if you're interested in learning more about composting. I do some virtual and in-person kind of one-off classes throughout the year. You can find those on our OSU Extension calendar of events. If you go to calendar.okstate.edu and you search extension, you can actually set a filter on that calendar by topic and by location, and you can find classes that come up. You can search even, I think, and probably type in composting and see what comes up. The Master Composter class itself is currently just a 6-week in-person class, and it's always held mid-September through mid-October. However, we do have a fleet of online kind of self-paced virtual online classes that you can find. So if you go to, I think it's learn.extension.okstate.edu. I can verify that, but we have probably 20 different online modules that you can take. So I developed a backyard chickens class you can take for learning about backyard chicken raising, and it's a self-paced virtual class. I'm working on eventually getting one on composting up there. I haven't done that yet, but that's a goal of mine. So maybe at some point there will be an online kind of self-paced virtual composting class, but we don't have that yet.
We are coming up on that 1-minute marker. I want to be mindful of everyone's time here. So if you need to jump off, definitely want to be mindful of your time. I will follow up in an email with all of the links that we've been talking about and the resources throughout this presentation, along with the recording. So that should be available hopefully by tomorrow, as long as nothing goes wrong with getting it downloaded. But we do have 2 questions, and those will be our last 2 questions for this session. So that way we're being mindful of Josh's time and your time. Somebody would ask if with the clippings, the lawn clippings, how do you age the clippings? In a bag and let them set for a while, or is there a different method?
Yeah, really great questions. I think all of you need to come join my Master Composter class. I've done it both ways. I don't know necessarily that there's a lot of science to whether you age it in a bag or open air. You're going to have the potential of maybe getting a little bit of anaerobic in an enclosed bag for a long time, but I age them in bags for a long time. One of my favorite methods, though, is just using like a little wire mesh and piling up grass clippings and leaves in like a little contained wire mesh area in their own area. And then as they age, I just use them, a year-old clippings and leaves and stuff as kind of the cap material for my compost piles when I'm adding, say, vegetable scraps or something, and I need that material to cover up. I'll use that aged grass clipping or leaf material.
And then the last question before we conclude is back to the coffee grounds question. Mm-hmm. Is there a difference when you use regular versus decaf, or is it essentially the same when using used coffee grounds in your compost?
That's a really good question. I have not heard of there being a difference in terms of the usefulness in composting. Certainly there's processes that are used with decaf to extract the caffeine from the coffee, but there's still going to be nitrogen there in that coffee. And so I would think that no matter whether it's regular or decaf, that it would make a great material for your compost. Don't be afraid to go to Starbucks or other scooters, other coffee places that give their grounds for free and get those coffee grounds and use them.
Well, I think that was the final question. I have appreciated this workshop and your time here. I learned some new things about composting and gardening, and I look forward to implementing some of those, as I believe maybe some others that attended as well. But we greatly appreciate your time, Josh, and hope to have you back for some more future talks. We'd love to learn more from.
I would love that. Thank you, everybody.
Program. Thank you.